I never saw the money, not a dollar, not a conversation, not even a warning. I was 17 when I found out the college fund that had been set aside for both kids was gone, spent, signed over to my older brother as a wedding gift. Not for an emergency, not for tuition, not even for something remotely justifiable. It went toward beachfront honeymoon photos, a custom champagne tower, and a suite in Bora Bora where he proposed a second time, because the first ring wasn't impressive enough, and I was handed a catalog of community colleges and a hug. No fund, no chance. Just a gentle pat on the back and the same dismissive phrase I'd heard since I was old enough to realize who was holding the scales. Your brother needed it more than you. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 now, but that moment, the silence after their sentence, still plays in my head like it happened yesterday. My brother Jacob was the golden boy. Charming, athletic, the kind of man who looked like he belonged on a magazine cover with America's favorite son stamped across his chest. My parents adored him to the point of delusion. They didn't just excuse his selfishness, they paved roads with it. If Jacob failed, they blamed the system. If I succeeded, they called it luck. Growing up in western Pennsylvania in a modest two-story home, I never thought we were rich. But my father always talked about Rachel and Jacob's college account like it was a sacred vault, carefully grown from birthday bonds, side income, even inheritance from a great uncle we'd never met. No matter what happens, your futures are secured, he'd say proudly, hand on my shoulder. But Jacob's future came first, always did, when he got engaged at 26 to a woman named Shelby, an Instagram influencer with veneers and a voice like sugar. My parents nearly passed out from excitement. Suddenly, their every breath was devoted to making that wedding spectacular. No price was too high, no detail too small. They drained savings, maxed out cards, and without even blinking, transferred the entirety of what should have been my college fund to him. I wasn't even told by them. I found out through a casual comment from Shelby at one of their many engagement parties. So sweet your parents gave Jacob the college fund for the honeymoon. That spa villa in Maldives is going to be insane. I laughed, thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Later that night, I confronted my parents. I stood in the kitchen, fists clenched, voice trembling. You used the college fund? My college fund? Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom was more direct. It was a joint account, and you were still deciding where to apply. Jacob needed it. The timing made sense. The timing made sense. That was their excuse for throwing away everything they'd promised me, for treating my future like small change, while Jacob's marriage was treated like an investment. And then came the phrase, the sentence that burned into my bones like acid. He needed it more than you. There was no apology, just a suggestion to take a year, figure things out, and maybe apply for financial aid. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I left, walked out the front door in the middle of winter with nothing but my coat and a bitter taste in my mouth that would stay for years. I worked 2 jobs, diner in the morning, retail at night. I enrolled in online business courses with my tips and sold sketches on Etsy in between shifts. College for me wasn't a dorm room and friends. It was fast food breaks, closed laptops, and clinging to dreams I couldn't afford. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't check in. They were too busy posting honeymoon photos of Jacob and Shelby sipping mimosas and kissing under waterfalls. Hashtag just blessed. The following Christmas, they gave me a $40 Amazon gift card and a framed photo of Jacob's wedding day, as if that would erase what they'd taken, as if my silence meant my forgiveness. I never gave them a piece of my mind. I gave them distance. That was harder. That hurt more. But I also gave myself something they never had: accountability. If no one was going to invest in me, I would invest in myself. That choice, lonely, brutal, but mine, would change everything. Because years later, when I'd made it, when my name was on Forbes and my company was worth more than the house they worshiped Jacob in, they came back. They came back with flowers, a rehearsed smile, and a nervous knock on my gate. But they didn't know what was waiting for them. They didn't know about the cameras, the security system, the locked gates, and the woman they had underestimated. They didn't know that everything they once denied me, power, respect, freedom, was now mine. Not because they gave it to me, but because they didn't. And I had no intention of opening that gate. Not yet. Let me tell you how I got there. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from being told, without hesitation, that your future doesn't matter as much as someone else's joy, that your potential is negotiable, disposable, tradable for a honeymoon suite and a few filtered photos on a beach you'll never see. But I didn't break. I bent, quietly, painfully, and then I redirected everything they threw at me into fuel. After that night in the kitchen, I packed what little I had, my notebooks, a few clothes, and my art supplies, into the trunk of my car and drove until I found a friend's couch to crash on. No one begged me to stay, no one followed me out the door. In the months that followed, I was barely surviving. I picked up shifts at a local diner, pouring coffee for early morning regulars and scraping together tips to afford frozen dinners. I enrolled in a few online courses from a state university, just enough to keep my dream alive, even if it was barely breathing. When my manager at the diner realized I was taking business and digital design courses on my phone during breaks, he offered me one afternoon shift a week off the books so I could do freelance flyer work for local businesses. It wasn't glamorous. Half of it was formatting pizza coupons and dental clinic banners. But it gave me something my parents never offered, a chance to prove myself. While Jacob and Shelby were posting photos from their second honeymoon in Santorini, gifted by Shelby's brand partners, I was learning SEO algorithms at 2 a.m. and submitting designs for $10 a pop on Fiverr. My body was exhausted, but my mind was sharpening. I never went to prom, never joined a sorority, never took part in what people call the college experience. My experience was different. It was raw, self-made, and baptized in rejection. And yet, I was learning faster than most of the kids sitting in lecture halls. Eventually, I landed a remote internship with a small but growing digital agency out of Austin. They didn't care that I didn't have a degree yet. They cared about my portfolio, and I had been silently building one for 2 years. Logos, email campaigns, ad graphics, click-through reports. By 21, I had 6 clients of my own. By 22, I had learned how to file an LLC. I called it Crimson North Media. No investors, no fancy startup money, just sweat, time, and sheer defiance. When my parents heard through a cousin that I had a little business, they sent a congratulatory card with a pre-printed message and no return address. The last line read, "Hope it works out. Mom and Dad." That was the year Jacob and Shelby threw a gender reveal for their second baby. I wasn't invited. No one asked if I had time off. No one asked if I was even in town. My existence was like furniture to them, occasionally acknowledged, mostly ignored, and honestly, by then I preferred it that way. They had chosen their favorite, built their narrative. Jacob was the success story. I was the stubborn one, the scrappy kid who made things harder for herself. But in the background, Crimson North was expanding. I brought on 2 contractors, one for copywriting, one for analytics. I studied every business podcast I could find, downloaded webinars during my commutes, and cold-pitched local businesses for rebranding packages. My client base tripled. One day, I got a call from a senior brand executive at a retail startup based in Chicago. He said, "I keep hearing your name. Everyone's saying, 'This girl gets it. We want in.'" That was my first 5-figure contract. I remember that day vividly, not because of the money, but because I looked around my 1-bedroom apartment, still furnished with thrift store finds, and said out loud, "I did this. Me, not them." That night, I didn't celebrate. I worked. I reinvested every dollar into upgrading equipment, building a scalable CRM, and hiring a part-time project manager named Devin, who would eventually become my chief operating officer. Jacob and Shelby, still taking vacations, still relying on family support. And me? I was slowly building a digital empire from a laptop held together with duct tape and prayer. But I wasn't trying to prove them wrong anymore. I was trying to prove myself right, because by now I had seen something powerful. I didn't need to be chosen. I didn't need applause. I didn't need family funds or validation. I had something far more valuable: clarity. The clarity that comes when people show you who they are, and you stop begging them to be anything different. That's when things changed again. A speaking opportunity came. Then another. Then I was invited to give a workshop at a national tech conference in Denver. The keynote speaker that year? a billionaire CEO whose brand had once ignored my internship application. I gave my presentation after hers. Half the room stayed, the other half came in for me. That night, she offered me a consulting role for one of her new ventures. Within 2 months, I had to turn clients away. I wasn't just making it, I was ascending. And no one from my family had a clue. It wasn't that I was hiding, I just stopped explaining. By the time I turned 25, Crimson North had evolved from a solo hustle into a full-scale branding and analytics firm. We had 8 team members, quarterly retreats, and an inbox I couldn't clear without help. But when my aunt sent me a Facebook message asking, "So, are you still working at that coffee shop?" I realized something. They still had no idea who I was. I let them believe whatever story they'd spun. The one where I drifted, struggled, probably resented my brother too much to be present for family events. The one where I was just different, maybe difficult. The one that let me sleep at night thinking about a way to tell me you were just a mistake by an excellent teacher and to Jake was funny with me. And that was fine by me. Because while they were busy building engines, I was building a career. At 26, I can manage a deal with a mid-sized skincare company looking to rebrand their entire digital presence. The contract was worth more than my parents' entire mortgage. And yet, I never picked up the phone to say, "Look at me now." I didn't need them to look. I needed them to feel the silence they'd created. Around the same time, Jacob lost his job. Something about restructuring, layoffs, and being unfairly targeted. He started freelancing part-time for friends of friends. And Shelby? She went from luxury hauls to coupon codes real quick. I only knew this because mutuals from high school followed me on LinkedIn and sent the occasional, "Your brother's back in town, looks rough." Still, I stayed quiet. But something changed that summer. A real estate broker I'd worked with called and said, "I've got a property you should see. Remote, gated, gorgeous. No one would bother you again." I visited it once and signed the papers within the week. It was a sleek, modern estate with a security system so advanced it could tell when a squirrel sneezed on the front lawn. I built my home office overlooking the forest, installed a wine wall just because I could, and bought a fireproof safe where I stored a single photo. Me at 18, outside the diner, wearing a borrowed coat and a smile I no longer recognized. That photo kept me grounded. Because success didn't erase the betrayal. It simply reframed it. I used to think forgiveness would come with time. That one day I'd see Jacob, hear him say, "I'm sorry," and feel the weight lift. But years passed. He never said a word. Instead, one day, out of nowhere, my mother sent a text. "Your father and I would love to come visit sometime. Just the two of us. We miss you." No apology, no explanation, just those words. "We miss you." I read it twice, then locked my phone and went back to work. Later that week, a florist called. They wanted to confirm delivery details for a beautiful white orchid arrangement from Robert and Karen. My parents. I laughed. It wasn't funny, it was sad. Because the flowers were just a symbol. A last-ditch effort to repair what they didn't even understand was broken. They didn't realize that when they drained that account, they weren't just taking my money. They were taking my belief that I mattered, that I was worth planning for, sacrificing for, that I belonged. But life has a funny way of paying attention when no one else does. I was 28 when Forbes ran a feature titled "Women Who Built Empires from Nothing." My photo was there, standing in front of the same gate my parents would soon stand outside of. They never called about it, never congratulated me, but they saw it. I know they did, because 2 months later, just before the holidays, they showed up, not metaphorically, physically at my gate, dressed like they were attending a garden party, clutching flowers, a tin of cookies, and sheepish smiles that tried to smooth over 10 years of silence. They looked up at the camera above the intercom and waved like strangers. My security team buzzed me. "Ma'am, there's a Mr. and Mrs. Hanson at the gate. Says they're your parents. Should we let them in?" I walked to the monitor, looked at the feed, studied their faces, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel hurt, or angry, or hollow. I felt absolutely nothing. I picked up the speaker. "Yes," I said calmly, "those are my parents." There was a pause. "Should we open the gate?" I smiled, not cruelly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who's finally in control. "No," I said, "not today." And then I turned off the monitor. Because the thing about gates, they're not just to keep others out, they're to remind you who you built them for in the first place. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. Just calm. As I turned away from the monitor, the silence in my house felt heavier than usual, but not in a sad way, in a clean way, like the weight of carrying them all those years had finally been lifted. I didn't need their guilt. I didn't need a performance wrapped in orchids and cookies. I had already survived the worst version of them. Anything after that, optional. Still, I won't lie. Part of me sat by the window that night, just watching the driveway. They stayed out there longer than I expected, parked in their beige sedan with the engine off and the flowers still wilting on the dashboard. My mother, nervously twisting her wedding ring. My father, staring at the house like it was something he'd never seen before. They left after 20 minutes, drove away without honking or buzzing again. No drama, no confrontation. I went to bed without mentioning it to anyone, but the next morning I told Zoe. Zoe was my operations lead, and if I'm being honest, my best friend. We'd met when she applied for a junior marketing job. She came in with zero fluff and told me flat out, "You're building something real. Let me help. I'm good at making chaos make sense." She wasn't lying. Zoe had become the person I trusted most, the one who saw me not as someone to save, but someone worth standing beside. No questions asked, just steady presence and sarcastic wit. And when I told her about my parents' visit, she didn't gasp or overreact. She just poured 2 coffees and said, "So, what now?" That question lingered, because the truth is, I hadn't planned for after the gate stayed closed. I'd planned for the struggle, the hustle, the rejection, even the climb, but not the echo that follows the silence. I thought I'd feel healed when I reached this point, but healing isn't a destination. It's a habit, one I was still learning how to practice. So I did what I always did when my emotions got too loud. I went back to work. That week, we launched a campaign that went viral. One of our clients, a small wellness brand out of Seattle, suddenly had a 6-month wait list thanks to a single product video we orchestrated. A few influencers reposted it. Within hours, we were on the front page of Product Hunt, and industry forums were lighting up with praise. That win felt like oxygen. And in the middle of that high, I got a text from Jacob. Not a hey, not an I'm sorry, just, "Are you free to talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. I hadn't spoken to my brother in nearly 6 years. The last real conversation we'd had was when he called me dramatic for being upset about the college fund. Said I didn't understand the pressure he was under to provide for a new wife and new life. Apparently, I didn't understand what it felt like to be supported unconditionally. So he was right, but something in me had changed. So I replied, "Tomorrow, 2 p.m. video call only." At 2 o'clock the next day, his face popped onto the screen. Older, slightly weathered, still handsome in that used-to-be captain of the football team way, but his eyes looked tired. He didn't start with pleasantries. "I didn't know what they did," he said flatly. I folded my arms. "Did what?" "Used your college fund. I didn't know it was everything. I thought—" He sighed. "I thought Dad had some other savings, that it was a partial gift. They told me you were still deciding, that you weren't serious about college yet." I didn't interrupt. He kept going. "Shelby and I didn't last. We split a year ago. Too much pressure, too many lies. I'm back in Pittsburgh now, working part-time at a co-working space, trying to get a freelancing thing going, but honestly, I'm flailing." There it was, no spin, no ego. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked quietly. Jacob looked straight at the camera. "Because I saw the article, the gate, everything. And it hit me. I had a front row seat to someone brilliant, and I never looked up." He paused, voice low. "You deserved that money more than I ever did." I didn't need the apology, but I appreciated the clarity. "I built it anyway," I said. "Everything I wanted, I earned it on my own, with no shortcuts, no favors." "I know," he nodded. "That's why it matters." We sat in silence for a moment. Then he added, "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to say it out loud." That moment could have reopened everything. The wounds, the rage, the grief. But it didn't, because something had shifted. I wasn't trapped in the story they wrote about me anymore. I'd picked up my own pen a long time ago, and I was halfway through the second act. "I appreciate the call," I told him. Really, but I'm not interested in repairing something just because you're uncomfortable with the silence. If there's a future relationship between us, it has to be built, intentionally, earned, not inherited. I get that, he said softly. I'll show up, however I can. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated. But for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar where my brother used to live. Possibility, and that. That was enough, for now. I didn't tell anyone else about the conversation with Jacob. Not Zoe, not my therapist, not even Devin, who had become my second brain and the only person who could predict my mood from a single email subject line. I needed to sit with it first. Jacob's apology, if you could call it that, wasn't just about words. It was about something bigger. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for access. He was simply asking to be seen again. This time not through the filter of family roles we'd been cast into since birth, but through something more honest. And I wasn't ready to decide if that was something I wanted. But the world doesn't wait for emotional clarity. That same week, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership summit in San Diego. One of those glossy events where panelists wore designer blazers and PR interns hovered like hummingbirds. The keynote theme was Redefining Legacy. And something about that title hit me in the gut. Legacy. My parents had always made it clear what theirs would be: raising a son they believed in and a daughter they tolerated. Their legacy was built on hierarchy, on bias, on investments carefully placed where pride would grow fastest. But mine? Mine wasn't tied to blood or titles or roles. Mine was a collection of every cracked open door I pushed through. Every girl like me who chose to bet on herself when no one else would. The night before my talk, I rewrote the entire speech. I stood on that stage the next morning and told a room full of women, executives, students, founders, and fighters, the truth. That I had been underestimated by my own family. That my dreams were once considered optional, disposable. That the same people who funded a beach honeymoon couldn't find a reason to invest in my education. I told them how I built something from that pain, how I took rejection and turned it into revenue, how I stopped waiting for permission. I didn't name names, I didn't need to. But the silence in the room when I said, some of us are told, you're strong, you'll figure it out, and we do. But that doesn't mean it didn't cost us something. That silence was full of people who understood. After the event, a woman in her 60s approached me. She introduced herself as a retired school administrator and said, "You didn't just tell your story, you told mine too. I wish someone had told me at 25 that it wasn't my fault they chose someone else." I nodded, blinking back a sudden wave of heat behind my eyes. Because that was the thing. The pain of being second wasn't rare. It was just quiet, hidden under decades of grace, smiles, and silence. That evening, I flew back home and found a package waiting for me on the porch. No name, no note. Just an envelope with a return address from my hometown. Inside was a photo, me and Jacob, age 6 and 8, covered in finger paint, smiling like the world hadn't yet handed us separate labels. Underneath it, a single handwritten sentence. Trying to remember what we were before they made us compete. His handwriting, no signature needed. I didn't know what to do with it. I held that photo in my hands for a long time, standing barefoot in the entryway of a house that neither of us had ever dreamed possible. And for a moment, I wasn't a multimillionaire. I wasn't a CEO. I was just a girl whose brother once shared her crayons and now wanted to share a version of peace. The next morning, I called Zoe into my office. "We're expanding," I told her. She blinked. "Okay? You mean the agency?" Number Y mean the mission. I walked her through a new plan, a nonprofit mentorship and micro-grant program for women under 25 who were pursuing education or business on their own, with no family support, no financial backing, and no safety net. "We've built a machine that prints wealth," I told her. "Now we build one that prints opportunity." She grinned, her eyes already scanning for task management platforms. "Name?" I paused, then smiled. "Second Fund." Because for all of us who were told we were second choice, second best, or second priority, we weren't second anything. We were first in line for a different kind of greatness. 2 months later, the Second Fund launched quietly without press. Just a simple site, an application portal, and a few testimonials from women I had met during panels and summits. And yet, within weeks, the inbox overflowed. Stories from waitresses and janitors and student moms, from daughters who paid rent instead of tuition, from sisters whose brothers got everything they were told to make peace without. One applicant wrote, "I've been sleeping in my car while studying for the LSAT. Everyone says I'm resilient. I'd rather just be safe." I approved her grant the same day, and as I wired the funds, I thought again of my parents, still silent after the gate, still watching from afar. They hadn't tried again. No letters, no calls, no new visits. But they didn't need to, because I wasn't building anything for them. I was building for the girl who once waited for permission to be worth something. And now, I was giving that permission away like currency. One overlooked woman at a time. The knock came 6 months later. Not an email, not a call, not a formal letter, a knock, like they had every right. I had just wrapped a Zoom call with a client in Berlin when Zoe poked her head into my office, phone in hand, eyebrows raised in that way that always meant, "You're not going to like this." "There's a couple at the gate," she said, voice flat. "They say they're your parents, again." I didn't respond right away. "Do they have flowers?" I finally asked. She looked at the camera feed. "Roses, and some kind of casserole dish. I think they're trying the whole nostalgic family meal angle now." I almost laughed, almost, but instead I closed my laptop and walked down to the control panel myself. There they were again, Robert and Karen Hansen, my father in his stiff, too formal blazer, my mother clutching a glass dish wrapped in foil, as if one meal could erase 10 years of decisions they never dared own. They looked older this time, not just in years, but in posture, in presence. There was no false cheer in their eyes this time, just fatigue, and maybe something that looked like hope. But I didn't buzz them in. I spoke through the intercom. "You didn't call." "We weren't sure you'd answer," my mother replied, voice thinner than I remembered. My father cleared his throat. "We read about the fund, the nonprofit, and the magazine article." There it was. They didn't come back when I launched my agency, not when I got featured, not when I bought the estate or was named on Forbes's list. They came back when they realized other people, strangers, now saw me as something worth admiring, that their version of the story, the one where I was the hard-headed daughter who took a different path, had been rewritten by the world without their permission. "What do you want?" I asked, arms crossed. Silence. Then my mother spoke. "To talk, to apologize." "Now?" "We didn't know how to before," she said quietly. "We didn't think it would matter." "And Jacob?" I asked. "He's the one who told us to come," she admitted. "He said we should see what we missed. Really see it. And we do now. We're late, but we do." It would have been so easy to let them in, to imagine a dramatic, emotional scene with forgiveness and reconciliation and tears in the foyer. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't crave apologies like oxygen. I didn't confuse guilt with growth. So I asked them one thing. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" They were quiet again. Then my father spoke, and for once there was no performance in his voice. No tired superiority. "For treating you like you'd figure it out so we didn't have to help. For believing support was something only Jacob needed. For choosing what was easy over what was right. For being cowards." It wasn't eloquent, but it was true. I didn't say anything right away. Then I buzzed open the gate, not because they deserved it, but because I needed to know what came next. They walked up slowly, my mother still holding the casserole like a peace offering from another universe. I didn't hug them. I didn't ask them inside. We sat outside on the stone bench under the birch tree by the garden, the same bench I had sat on a year ago when my Forbes issue arrived in the mail. They talked. I listened. They explained how they had been following my career quietly for years, how they had seen every milestone but convinced themselves I didn't need their voice in the chorus, how they'd made peace with Jacob, who'd told them plainly, "You can't buy your way back into Rachel's life." And when the casserole dish began to cool, when the wind had picked up slightly and their voices started to fade, I finally spoke. "I'm not angry anymore," I told them. But I'm also not the girl who needed your apology to feel whole. That girl died a long time ago. The one you're talking to now doesn't want to relive the past. My mother's eyes glistened, but she nodded. We understand. You might mean that, I said, but understanding doesn't equal access. My father inhaled sharply. What does equal access? Consistency, time, action. I stood up then, brushing invisible dust off my pants. You don't get to step into the good part of my life just because you're finally ready to witness it, but if you want to try, if you're serious, you'll start the way anyone else would, at the gate, and you'll wait. And with that, I turned and walked back into the house. Zoe was waiting just inside, sipping from her coffee and watching the feed from the camera. Well, she said, that was restrained. I smirked. I'm evolving. She raised her mug. To evolution. That night, I set the casserole on the counter and left it untouched. Not out of spite, but because some offerings are symbolic, and I wasn't hungry for the past anymore. I was full, finally, on my own terms. By the following week, I'd almost forgotten the visit. Almost, but something odd happened that Friday. I walked into the Second Fund office, our new space in the Arts District downtown, and found a stack of handwritten letters waiting on my desk. No stamps, no mail packaging, just neat envelopes tucked inside each other, carefully marked in my father's tidy block handwriting, each one addressed to a woman I'd helped. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, but when I opened the first one, I understood. They weren't letters from him. They were letters to me, transcribed by him, from grant recipients. Notes I'd received digitally over the past few months. Thank yous, stories, testimonials. Only now, written out in longhand, each one dated, organized by the recipient's name and location. At the bottom of the stack was a note in my mother's cursive, "We can't rewrite history, but maybe we can help you carry what you've built." I didn't cry, but I sat there for a long time staring at that pile, not because it meant everything, but because it finally meant something. They had started showing up to Second Fund meetings as volunteers. Quietly, no introductions, no mention of being my parents. They handled back-end mailings, helped organize scholarship binders, and sorted intake forms. When Zoe noticed, she raised an eyebrow and asked, "You good with this?" I thought about it. "They're not at my dinner table," I said. "They're not at my boardroom. They're at the edge of my story. That's where they need to be for now." She nodded. Let them earn chapters if they want them. Because that's what growth really is. It's not letting people walk back in with a smile and a gift basket. It's letting them prove they can sit quietly in the seat they once rejected and watch what you became despite them. And as I built, I kept expanding. That summer, Crimson North crossed its first $1 million quarter. Our campaign for a small eco-fashion label went viral, again. Suddenly everyone wanted us. Startups, mid-level brands, even legacy corporations with tired reputations that needed fresh blood. My team tripled. We hired new designers, built a podcast studio, created a sister agency focused solely on youth-led marketing strategies. And at every major milestone, my phone would buzz, not with a call, but with a short, text-only message from my brother. "Proud of you. Saw the ad. You killed it. I told them you were always the real deal." He never asked for a handout, never hinted at favors. He even donated, quietly, to the Second Fund, under an alias. That fall, I invited him to coffee. Not dinner, not family brunch, just coffee. He showed up on time, sat quietly, "Let me talk first." "I can't fix the past," he said, "but I'm trying to be someone better in your future, if you'll have me." That was the first time I let him hug me in years. It wasn't magical, it wasn't a Hallmark card, but it was real. And real was enough. He came with me to the Second Fund Winter Benefit Gala that December, wore a tie, made a donation, even brought a woman he was seeing. Soft-spoken, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who didn't need to flash anything to impress a room. When we walked into the ballroom, I felt it. Not pride, exactly, but peace. The kind that settles in your bones when you realize you didn't just survive your past, you transcended it. And sitting at the gala, among scholarship recipients and mentors and supporters from every chapter of my journey, I made a decision. It was time. Time to tell the full story, not just to strangers on stages or in articles, but to the girl I used to be. So I started writing a book, The Second Gate, about inheritance, identity, and how sometimes your legacy isn't what you're given, but what you refuse to let define you. The first chapter? It starts with a girl holding a college rejection letter and watching her brother pop champagne on a beach. It ends with a woman standing inside her own empire, pressing a button that keeps the gate closed. Not out of spite, but out of sovereignty. Because that's what I learned. You don't owe anyone entry just because they share your name. They have to earn it like everyone else, step by step, brick by brick. And in the meantime, you build for yourself and for every woman who was told she'd figure it out because she was strong. Yes, we're strong, but we deserve to be safe too. That's what the fund does. That's what I do. And no apology will ever match that kind of power. It was a crisp March morning when the doorbell rang again, but this time I wasn't surprised. I'd seen the black sedan pulling into the driveway through the security app. I'd seen the hesitation in the way they parked, how they sat for a few minutes before finally stepping out. I'd even seen the bouquet before they reached the steps, but what I didn't expect was the letter. My father handed it to me wordlessly. No speech, no, "How are you?" Just a folded envelope with my name in his handwriting. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I let them sit in the entryway. I made tea. No music, no food, no performance. We weren't doing any more scenes. We were here for the truth. When I finally unfolded the letter, it wasn't long, just a page. No apologies this time, no pleading, just a list, a full accounting of the college fund, dates, transfers, signatures, how much was moved, when it was moved, even how much was spent on the honeymoon versus gifted cash versus non-refundable resort bookings. And at the bottom, one line that made me stop breathing for a second. We were wrong, and we don't expect you to forgive us, but we will keep showing up until we're worthy of whatever space you're willing to give us. I looked up. My parents weren't young anymore. The guilt had aged them more than time, and for once, they didn't look like the people who held all the power. They looked like people who knew they had given it up without realizing what it would cost. "You know," I said quietly, "you didn't just take money." They both nodded, no protest. "You took time, milestones, you took my right to dream without fear. You made me beg for basics I was promised, and when I succeeded, you acted like I was just being difficult for not letting it go." My mother's hands trembled around her teacup. "I know," she whispered, and somehow that made it worse. But they knew all along, only they were a bit once they told me to pay attention. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired of being the only one who carried the weight and could just watch from a distance. "You don't get to pretend this is normal now," I said. "You don't get family dinners and smiling photos and Sunday brunches just because you finally decided to name what you did." "We're not asking for normal," my father said. "We're just asking for the chance to do better. Quietly, consistently, however you'll let us." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked them out. And this time, I opened the gate for them myself. Not to welcome them back, but to let them leave with dignity. Because some forgiveness doesn't come in the form of words or warm embraces. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from not saying every sharp thing you could, from choosing legacy over revenge. They didn't come back the next week, or the one after. But 2 Saturdays later, I received a package. Inside was a simple gold bracelet. It was the one my grandmother had worn, my mother's mother. I hadn't seen it since I was a child. It came with a note. She told me once that one of her granddaughters would make the family name mean something new. I didn't know she meant you, but I see it now. Mom. I didn't cry, but I wore the bracelet the next day, not for her, for me. For the girl who once stood in a kitchen and heard, "He needed it more than you." And for the woman who now knew, without a doubt, she didn't need anyone's permission to be worth everything. That spring, we held the first Second Fund Fellowship Summit. Hundreds of women flew in from across the country, former grantees, new applicants, volunteers, and speakers. We gathered in the same ballroom where my first recognition dinner had been held, years earlier, when I was still just a woman trying to find footing in a world that kept moving the ground beneath her. Now, I was the keynote. When I stepped onto that stage, the lights were warm, the silence was electric, and I told them all what no one had told me. You are not second choice. You are not second best. You are the first chapter in a story they never saw coming. And when I stepped off stage, there was my brother in the crowd, clapping with tears in his eyes. There was Zoe, beaming like always. And somewhere far in the back, near the last row, were my parents. Not front and center, not spotlighted, just there, exactly where they needed to be, watching, learning, and for once finally listening. The thing about healing? It doesn't come all at once. There's no golden sunrise, no final hug, no music swelling in the background to let you know you've made it. Sometimes, healing looks like leaving a chair empty at your own table and being okay with it. Sometimes it looks like walking past a gift from someone who hurt you and not flinching. Sometimes it sounds like silence where a scream used to live. I learned that the hard way. After the fellowship summit, life didn't suddenly wrap itself up in a neat little arc. There were still questions, still memories, still sharp edges from a life that hadn't always made space for me. But there was peace, too, because I had stopped asking for a version of the past that could never exist. And more importantly, I had stopped apologizing for the version of the future I was building. A few weeks after the summit, I sat down for an interview with a major business magazine. The journalist was kind but sharp, one of those interviewers who could sense exactly where to push. Halfway through the conversation, she paused and asked, "Do you think you've forgiven them?" She didn't say who, she didn't have to. I sat back, glanced at the notebook in my lap, and said, "I think I've forgiven myself first." For what? For believing it was ever my fault, for thinking I had to prove anything to people who chose not to see me. She nodded, wrote something down, then asked the question I hadn't expected. If you could go back to that moment when they said he needed it more than you, what would you say? I didn't answer right away. Because truthfully, there wasn't one perfect thing to say. No cinematic comeback, no poetic mic drop. So I spoke the only honest thing I had. I'd say nothing, I'd just leave the room again, same way I did the first time. But this time, I'd understand that walking away wasn't weakness. It was the first act of becoming someone powerful. The article was published the following month with the headline, "She Closed the Gate, Then Built Her Own Empire." It went viral. But more than the views or reposts or podcast invites that followed, it was the emails that moved me most. From daughters, from mothers, from women who had spent decades asking why their name was left off the list, why their sacrifices were invisible, why their dreams were dismissed as expensive or unrealistic. One woman wrote, "My brother flunked out of college twice and my parents still paid for his third try. I got a job at 18 and never stopped. Your story told me I'm not crazy for feeling forgotten." Another said, "Your voice is what my daughter needed when she came home crying after being told she was too ambitious for a girl. We read your story together. Thank you for being the proof." I kept those messages, all of them. They became part of the Second Fund archive, a living library of reminders that our stories matter, especially when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're inconvenient. And then, one quiet afternoon, I received a different kind of message. Not through email, not through the press. It came in a simple envelope, hand-delivered. Inside was a check, made out to the Second Fund, signed by Robert and Karen Hansen. No note, no post-it, no explanation, just the check. It wasn't large, not compared to our usual sponsors or foundation partners, but it was something they had never offered before. A contribution with no strings, no expectations, no backdoor re-entry into my life, just quiet acknowledgement. I showed it to Zoe. She blinked once. "You cashing it?" I paused. "Yeah." "Good," she said. "Because what matters isn't the amount. It's the fact that for the first time, they understand who you are." I deposited it the next morning, not because we needed it, but because I needed to know they understood their place in this chapter, not as the heroes, not even as the villains, just as the past. And I had become the author. That summer, we opened our first Second Fund residency house in Colorado, a 6-bedroom space for young women building businesses or pursuing degrees while managing life alone, rent-free, resource-equipped, fully staffed with mentors, therapists, and financial literacy coaches. I flew out for the ribbon cutting, stood with a dozen young women who reminded me so much of myself it hurt to look at them too long. One of them, Marisol, 19, who had aged out of foster care while still finishing high school, asked me, "How did you know what we'd need?" And I smiled, because the answer was simple. Because nobody gave it to me, and I promised I'd be the last one who had to go without. That night, I stood on the porch as the stars settled over the mountain. Zoe joined me, passing me a glass of wine. "You did it," she said. I nodded. Not all of it, but enough. "Think you'll ever open the gate fully?" I knew what she meant. The gate inside me, the final forgiveness, the dinner table with both my parents seated across from me, not just physically, but emotionally. "I don't know," I said truthfully. "But maybe it's not about opening the gate anymore. Maybe it's about building something they can never tear down, even if they never understand it." She raised her glass. "To that." And under the stars, surrounded by a home I didn't inherit but made myself, I realized something. The gate was never just about them. It was about me, protecting what I built, valuing who I became, and finally, letting that be enough. Years later, when people ask about my turning point, I smile politely, but I never give them the answer they want. They expect me to say the business launch, or the Forbes feature, or the day I closed the gate. But it wasn't any of those things the real turning point. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to be anyone's daughter to be someone powerful, that my legacy wouldn't be built on family reputation or last names whispered through connections at dinner parties. It would be built on grit, on consistency, on decisions made quietly when no one was watching and everything hurt. It would be built on me. And as time passed, I watched the world change around that idea. The second fund expanded into 5 cities, partnering with universities, community centers, and private donors who didn't just write checks. They showed up. They mentored. They called. They offered internships to girls who once thought college was a fairy tale written for someone else. At 35, I became one of the youngest women to be invited to the National Policy Roundtable on Educational Equity. And when the moderator introduced me, she didn't say, "This is Rachel, who was once rejected by her own family." She said, "This is Rachel Hansen, founder, CEO, architect of a future where no young woman is told her dreams are too expensive." Not a daughter, not a second choice. A name I had turned into a statement. That fall, I returned to my hometown for the first time in over a decade. It wasn't a grand announcement. No film crew, no cameras, just a quiet decision to see what remained. The house I grew up in looked smaller than I remembered. The white shutters were chipping. The porch light flickered like it didn't want to stay on. There was a new car in the driveway, a modest hybrid, not the shiny SUV my father once bragged about. I didn't knock. I just sat in my car for a while watching the windows. I wondered if they saw me, if they recognized the woman behind the wheel. Then I drove to the high school down the road. I'd been invited to speak at Career Day, not as a graduate, just as a guest. I wasn't even listed on the official brochure. Someone's assistant had reached out last minute when another speaker canceled. I didn't mind, because the auditorium was filled with girls in scuffed sneakers and boys in hand-me-down jackets who didn't yet know that life could stretch beyond the neighborhood. I stood in front of them and said the thing I needed to hear at 17. If no one is investing in you, that doesn't mean you're not valuable. It means they don't see far enough. Build anyway. Afterward, a girl waited until the crowd cleared before approaching me. She had short curls, nervous eyes, and a notebook clutched tight to her chest. "Your story," she whispered, "feels like mine. But I don't have a Zoe, or a grandma, or anyone. I don't know if I can do it alone." I looked at her and smiled. "You're not alone. You've got us now." I handed her my card, wrote a number on the back, not my assistant's, not the foundation's, mine. Because that's what legacy really is. Not the companies you build, not the accolades, not the money. It's the door you open for someone else without asking for anything in return. It's the gate you don't close when it's her standing outside. A few months later, I received an invitation in the mail. Handwritten, thick paper, embossed. Jacob's wedding, again. Different woman, simpler tone, no RSVP pressure, just a note at the bottom. There's a seat for you. Only if you want it, no pressure. Just family if that word still fits. I didn't attend, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to anymore. Instead, I sent a gift, a wooden photo frame. Inside, a picture of us at the Fellowship Summit Gala, his arm over my shoulder, my eyes lit up in mid-laughter. Below the photo, I'd engraved 4 words. We got here anyway. Now? Now I spend my mornings in a house with wide windows and quiet floors. Zoe has her own wing. The second fund runs itself, nearly 3,000 grants awarded and counting. I write, I teach, I invest in women-owned startups not because I want equity, but because I want impact. Sometimes my parents call, sometimes they don't. That's fine. We don't talk about the past, not because it didn't happen, but because we've agreed not to put furniture in a room that collapsed years ago. We meet outside, on benches, in safe places, where things can be said without collapsing the sky. We exist in that delicate balance between accountability and time. They've never asked for forgiveness again, but they've never stopped showing up. And maybe that's enough. So no, my story doesn't end with a hug. It doesn't end with reconciliation or revenge. It ends with choice. Mine. To build, to close the gate, to open a new one. To leave the past behind. Not because it didn't matter, but because I did. I always did, even when they didn't see it, especially then. And now, as I stand at the edge of everything I've created, with women beside me who once believed they were forgotten, I know exactly who I am. I am the second child. I was the afterthought, but I became the blueprint, and nothing they gave or didn't give can take that away. I didn't set out to be a blueprint. I wasn't trying to start a movement. I was just trying to survive, to carve something out of nothing, to prove to myself mostly that I could make it on my own, that I didn't need anyone to open a door for me if I had the patience and strength to build one from scratch. But the thing about building something from the ground up is that eventually people notice. Other women started reaching out, not in droves at first, just a few at a time. A girl from Detroit, a woman from the Bronx, a mother of 3 who had never been told she was allowed to dream. Each story different, but underneath it all, the same thread. They said he needed it more than I did. It became a familiar melody, one I knew every word to. That line had been spoken in 1,000 different ways, in different cities and different households, but the implication was always the same. You're strong, you'll figure it out. He needs the help more. It wasn't just about money, it was about belief, it was about worth. So I leaned into the role. I hosted free virtual workshops, taught brand strategy to young women trying to run businesses out of studio apartments and spare bedrooms. Launched a mentorship series called The Second Seat, where female founders would interview women who'd never had a seat at the table and talk about how they made one. The first episode got 4,000 views, the next 100,000. Then the emails started flooding in. Girls from small towns, women from villages overseas, high schoolers, immigrants, survivors. Not one of them was asking for pity. They were asking for tools. That's when I realized I had moved past personal healing. I was building something scalable, something living. The second fund became a movement. And suddenly it wasn't about Jacob anymore. It wasn't about my parents or the past. It was about what came next. We opened community co-working centers for women whose families had told them that's not what girls do. We created an emergency fund for women at risk of losing housing while pursuing education. We built partnerships with hospitals, shelters, and workforce agencies. I met women who reminded me of every version of myself, hungry, hopeful, hardened by necessity but not broken. And when I looked into their faces, I felt it. Not pride, not pity, power. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was multiplying. I remember the moment I knew the work was bigger than me. I was in a boardroom in D.C., seated across from a senator and 2 policy advisors. They wanted to know how the second fund operated so efficiently with such low overhead, how our alumni had the highest employment rate among educational grant recipients in the country, how we'd managed to generate impact without bureaucracy. I told them the truth, because our model wasn't built on pity. It was built on potential. We didn't show up to rescue. We showed up to recognize. The room went silent. That's when I said something I hadn't planned to. You know who the women in our program remind me of? I said. The girls who sat quietly while their brothers got the new shoes. The daughters who were told college wasn't necessary. The women who were told, be grateful for what you get. They're not broken. They're buried under expectations, under silence, under generations of being the backup plan. I stood up, hands shaking just a little. We're not rebuilding them. We're just handing them the shovel. When I walked out of that room, I didn't know if we'd get the federal partnership we were hoping for, but I knew something had changed, because I had spoken not from statistics, but from truth. And truth, once spoken, doesn't go back to sleep. That year, the Second Fund opened its national headquarters, a former courthouse we converted into a collaborative hub for women-led startups. I stood in the main atrium on opening day, staring up at the arched ceilings where verdicts were once handed down, and now dreams were being written instead. Zoe came up beside me, holding a clipboard and a coffee. You realize what you've done, right? She said. I shrugged. Organized some really determined chaos? She smirked. You built a wall around every woman who's ever been told she's too much or not enough. And then you filled that wall with doors. I smiled, slow and full, because she was right. The gate I once closed wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new kind of architecture, one made of open doors, and women strong enough to walk through them. I never thought I'd see them there again, not Jacob, not my parents. But one Sunday afternoon, I was walking back from the new Second Fund Fellowship campus, a sprawling 3-acre property donated by a former grantee turned philanthropist, when my phone buzzed. There's someone at the gate, Zoe's message read. 3 someones. I didn't rush. I drove slowly, like the past could wait its turn this time. When I arrived, they were standing just outside the front entrance of the estate. Not at the security gate, not buzzing for access, not demanding to be let in. They were standing behind the gate, hands folded, silent. My mother had aged more than I remembered. Her hands looked smaller. My father stood beside her, not stoic as he once tried to be, but softer somehow. And Jacob, he didn't look nervous. He looked resolved. I walked up without words. Jacob stepped forward first. We're not here for anything, he said. Not a seat at the table, not even a conversation if you're not ready. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folder. I just wanted to give you this. I opened it right there. It was a deed to a property, 2 acres of wooded land outside our hometown. Not fancy, not flashy, but the title had been transferred to the Second Fund. No more flowers, he said quietly. No more casseroles, just action. We wanted to give something back that doesn't require your forgiveness. I looked up, unsure whether to speak. My voice caught in the back of my throat. And if we never get invited in, my father added, we'll still show up when it matters. We'll support what you've built, even from the curb. My mother finally spoke, tears threatening but held back. You gave us the blueprint when we didn't deserve the door. This is our way of saying, we see you now, fully, no conditions, just truth. I didn't invite them in that day, but I didn't turn them away either. I nodded once, quietly, and said, thank you. Because there are moments when a gate doesn't need to swing wide open to mean something. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is hold it steady and choose who passes through, when and why. They left soon after. No lingering, no questions. Just the kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. The kind that heals. 10 years after I walked away from my childhood kitchen, I stood at the podium of an international summit on generational wealth. I wasn't the guest speaker anymore. I was the closing keynote. Behind me were 15-foot-high LED displays, one looping clips of Second Fund graduates crossing stages, launching companies, buying homes, another displaying 4 words in bold white font, not second, first, chosen. I spoke without notes, without script. I told the audience about the girl who lost everything when her parents gave her future away for a honeymoon, about how pain doesn't make you powerful, but what you do with it can. I spoke about gates and who gets let in, and why sometimes the most radical act isn't slamming it shut or throwing it open, but installing the lock yourself. And as I ended, I said, They used to say I was the strong one because I didn't need help. They were wrong. I was the strong one because I helped myself, and then I turned around and helped every woman still standing on the outside. The room stood before I finished, not for applause, but because they saw it. Not just me, but themselves. The ones who were told to wait, to settle, to sacrifice. And yet they rose. After the speech, I stepped backstage and sat for a moment alone. I thought of that kitchen. The moment I heard, "He needed it more than you." The weight of that sentence once lived in my spine. It had bent me, scarred me. But now? Now it was something else, a fossil, buried deep beneath the foundation I had laid myself. I opened my phone and typed a single line into my notes app. They gave him the money. I built the world. That night, Zoe and I sat on the back patio of the estate, wine glasses in hand, watching the lights blink across the valley below. "So," she said, leaning back, "what's next?" I looked at her, at everything we'd created. Then I smiled. Doors everywhere, for every girl who thought she had to ask permission just to try. She raised her glass again. "To the ones they overlooked," she said, and I added softly, "and to the woman who made sure they never would be again." The wind moved gently, the stars stayed quiet, and in the distance, somewhere behind that long-ago gate, I knew the past was finally resting, because I wasn't just Rachel anymore. I was the legacy, the empire, the proof, and the future. It belonged to the ones who came second until we built something first. Built.